Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to speak to Bill S-9 today, which is an act to amend the criminal code, which is the bill on nuclear terrorism. This is a bill that's an S bill because it comes to us from the Senate. It concerns nuclear terrorism and amends the criminal code. It was done with the goal of implementing two international treaties that Canada has signed but not yet ratified, because you have to understand that in order to ratify a treaty, you have to have created the legislation that does so. So these two international treaties are intended to fight against terrorism, nuclear terrorism. So there's the amended version of the 2005 Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, that is to say the CPPMN, and the 2005 International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, that is to say the ICSANT. For the moment, Canada signed those two treaties in 2005. The process, when we talk about negotiating international treaties, is done in several stages in Canada. First of all, the negotiations, the signing, the ratification and implementation, and then they come into effect.
For these two treaties, we're only at the signature stage. But it should be pointed out that the signing of an international treaty is only the first step in the process for ratifying a treaty. Signature means that the country agrees in principle with the terms of the treaty and intends to be subject to it. After having signed a treaty, Canada must avoid actions that go against the intent of and the goal of the treaty, but it is not officially bound before ratification. We can see then that there's a long way to go before such treaties become really effective in our country. In order to ratify these treaties, Canada needs to amend some of its legislation. We need legislation to criminalize offenses described in these two treaties. That's the point of the bill, making the necessary amendments to the criminal code in order to ratify these two treaties and take another step toward their implementation. So I think we have to ask, what is it that these two treaties want to set in place? If we're talking about the CPPNM, ratified by Canada in 1980, its goal in 1980 was to develop measures linked to prevention, detection, and penalties for crimes related to nuclear substances. However, the field of application of the CPPNM was limited to nuclear matter used for peaceful purposes in international transport. There were amendments made in 2005 concerning the use, warehousing, and transportation of nuclear matter and peaceful nuclear facilities within a same country. And the amendments also brought forward aspects that promoted the cooperation between states, that is, developing measures for the recovery of stolen or illegally transferred nuclear matter, attenuation measures following sabotage, and fighting crime related to nuclear substances. This amendment clearly states that the objective of the Convention is to prevent offenses regarding nuclear matter and facilities worldwide and to facilitate cooperation between states. So Canada had ratified the 1980 version, but not the 2005 version that put forth the amendments I just discussed. If we look at the International Convention ICSANT. Its purpose was to provide for new criminal offenses for acts of nuclear terrorism and impose the obligation to prosecute or extradite in the case of criminal offenses involving nuclear terrorism. The bill was therefore created, had various sections that implemented the provisions in the two conventions. So it's important to understand how, as a New Democrat, I support this bill, and why has the NDP chosen to support this bill? Well, I think we all agree that nuclear terrorism is a threat and a significant issue in terms of international security. I think this is one of the threats that is among the worst in the world, because unfortunately we have seen the consequences. They can be completely disastrous. So right now we know not much is needed to cause significant damage, not only of citizens of a given country, but worldwide. So experts in this are very worried when you hear about a country that has a nuclear program that may be dubious. I think that this is extremely important in people's minds, not just Canadians, but internationally as well. I also want to point out that diplomacy and international cooperation are extremely important to us. Ratifying treaties that seek to solidify cooperation among countries on terrorism and nuclear terrorism is something that goes without saying. When you're talking about such worrisome situations as this for everyone's safety, I think you can't stick your head in the sand. We have no choice but to cooperate with all democratic entities in order to see results and ensure the safety of all citizens, be they citizens of our country or those abroad. I think one reason why I want to support this bill is the NDP is proud of our international reputation worldwide, even though I think it has been, Canada's reputation has been undermined by the Conservative government on many occasions over the past few years. But having one step forward in the ratification of these treaties shows that we have not forgotten our international commitments, and that might bring us back on the right track in terms of our international image. As many witnesses stated during the consideration of this bill by the Senate, one of the main ways of preventing radioactive material from ending up in the hands of terrorists is, of course, to strengthen nuclear security. In addition, when possible, reduce the use of nuclear materials for military use. That's simple logic. If we want to reduce the risk involved in the use of nuclear material, we need to make it less available so that terrorists have less opportunity to steal it and use it for nefarious, dangerous purposes for our society. So that is one first step that's quite obvious. In the military world, we should reduce the use of nuclear substances. That would eliminate a lot of problems down the road. As Matthew Bunn, an associate professor of public policy at Harvard University, pointed out during the Senate hearings, at scores of sites around the world, dramatically improved nuclear security has been put in place, and at scores of other sites, the weapons-usable nuclear material has been removed entirely, reducing the threat of nuclear threat at those sites to zero. More than 20 countries have eliminated all the weapons-usable nuclear material on their soil. These successes represent, in a real sense, bombs that will never go off. I think that it's worth repeating those words, bombs that will never go off, It reinforces the fact that the less we make use of such materials, and if we can get away with not using them at all, that's one bomb that can never be over our heads and will never explode. In that light, I think that Canada has to take concrete action to support nuclear safety worldwide. I think this bill is a step in the right direction. Although this bill applies to Canada, it's an effort that's of worldwide scope. Canada is only one of the signatories of these treaties. This is international cooperation toward a common goal. We really have to make sure that each country will do its share, and that's how we reduce risk for our fellow citizens. So, I repeat, this is really a treaty, or rather a bill, that is part of an objective of international cooperation. I think that in the past we were recognized internationally as a country that valued cooperation. So we have to continue to do our fair share and meet our international commitments. Now, if we're talking about diplomacy and international cooperation, I think we must have to remember that if Canada wants to play a frontline role once again in diplomacy and international cooperation, and if it wants to work toward convincing other countries to adopt a responsible approach to reduce the risk of terrorism and the theft of nuclear materials, we need to lead by example and take responsible measures. The ratification of these treaties by Canada will encourage other countries to take such measures and ratify them, and thus we will have done one more thing to improve world security. I'd like to open a parenthesis here. Although I'm pointing out the need to adopt these measures, when you're talking about nuclear safety, this is quite a complex issue. I think everyone agrees about that. So the fact that we seek to ratify these treaties and implement measures quickly doesn't mean that we should rush through the work in committee. I think the important thing here is to take the time to do this work properly, to consider this carefully, and only have to do it once and not have to make all sorts of adjustments later on. Although there's some urgency to this, and the government, the Conservatives have been in power for quite a while. They could have tabled a bill like this one much sooner. I think we still need to do this properly because it's the safety of our fellow citizens that is at stake after all. Once Canada is in a position to ratify the treaty, it would become the legal basis for Canada's cooperation with other signatory countries. So that includes, among other things, criminal investigations, mutual legal assistance, and extradition. This will improve opportunities for international cooperation and the fight against nuclear insecurity. The bill must be seen as an opportunity to gain access to the provisions of the treaty at the international level. But the bill has to be considered in committee in depth to verify its technical aspects. It seeks to implement legislation related to the provisions of the two international treaties, so the committee's work will allow us to examine the clauses and make sure the bill achieves its goal, allow us to ratify the two treaties signed in 2005. As I had set out earlier, Mr. Speaker, I think we really need to take the time to understand that when you're talking about nuclear safety, there are very important technical aspects here. So the committee has to do significant work, take time to examine the question in detail, and be sure that this bill really includes all the provisions necessary, that it goes far enough without going too far. What we need to target here is the best bill possible for the safety of our fellow citizens in a nonpartisan way, but also to ensure nuclear safety worldwide, because given the number of travelers that travel around the world every day, and even our proximity to certain borders, the fact remains that if an incident involving a nuclear bomb was used by terrorists outside our borders, it could still have consequences for Canadians abroad, for instance. So it's important to make sure that this bill is something to be proud of and that can serve as an example for other countries that haven't yet ratified various conventions. They could see what they could do to go forward when we're talking about nuclear safety. Regardless of the technical details of the bill, which will be examined in depth in committee, I'd like to point out that it's extremely important to have the ratification of these treaties progress in order to support our efforts to ensure nuclear safety worldwide. In 2010 and 2012, Canada and many other countries participating in nuclear safety summits made a commitment to ratifying these two conventions. Moreover, at the 2012 summit in Seoul, South Korea, participating states committed to having the 2005 amendment of the CPPNM in place by the 2014 summit. To achieve that, 2/3 of the 145 participating states have to ratify the treaty. Up till now, only 56 have done so. We need at least 97. Ratifying this treaty represents one step forward for the implementation of the amendment to the convention on an international scale. So it's one step forward for the whole world security, for nuclear safety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments?
L'honorable député de Gatineau.
Merci. The honourable member for Gatineau. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Abitibi-Témiscamingue, who made an excellent speech concerning a bill that's quite complicated. I said so during my speech. During the Senate hearings, I put a question to a Liberal colleague earlier, but I'd like the opinion of my New Democrat colleague. Senator Dallaire made a comment which reads more or less like this. I'd like to get back to the fact that we are seized with all these bills. We solve the points put to us, but even after the 2010 report, we don't have a good idea about fighting nuclear terrorism. We need to do our homework as legislators, but without a framework, our committee is not well equipped to have any certainty to determine whether the department or departments are doing what's necessary to fight terrorism. So let me ask my colleague whether she shares that view by Senator Dallaire, especially since she works very hard in national defense matters. The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, in order to determine whether a bill will truly represent a step forward on nuclear safety, we have to know what the dangers are and the risks are. As the Senator pointed out, when we don't have a good grasp of those dangers, it's difficult to assess whether we're truly closing the door to the use of nuclear materials for terrorism purposes. One has to understand that we have two contexts here. Yes, we want to shut the door to any terrorist use of these materials, but the bill also has to allow reasonable access to nuclear materials used for medical purposes, for instance. So when you're talking about nuclear safety, you have to strike a balance between those two aspects. If we don't really understand the gaps and the dangers in the current system, it's very difficult to figure out whether we're truly closing the door on such dangers. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Gatineau. I'd like to continue our dialogue, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to put a question that I put to many others today concerning the members' impression of how long it took to table this bill, Bill S-9, because we heard this on a number of occasions from our friends across the aisle in the Conservative government. They always make a fuss when we're talking about terrorism and tough military measures and so on. But yet this is a bill that has not been discussed. We are not against the bill. I don't think the Liberals are either. So why wait 5 years since the treaty was adopted to table Bill S-9 in the House? The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for her question. I was also surprised that it took 5 years before any sort of bill like this was tabled in the Commons. I said, well, it seems to me that when you're talking about nuclear safety, it's such a huge issue. I don't understand why they didn't choose to discuss this sooner. I think that just about everyone in the House intends to support the bill. So I don't understand why the government waited 5 years. They knew it wasn't a controversial bill. When it comes to the safety of the citizens we represent, to my mind, it's incomprehensible. Now, you have to understand that when a decision is made to table a bill like this, it opens the door to an analysis of current threats to safety. So that's another aspect that is a very good one to discuss. Is there any danger right now in Canada? For instance, should our military personnel get more training on nuclear threats? So there's a lot of questions here. And this bill will solve some of these problems. So I'm really surprised the government waited 5 years. I don't think they were waiting for me to get here, but I still find that strange. Questions and comments?
L'honorable député.
Honourable Member for Honoré Mercier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that my colleague is very experienced on this matter. I'm not. I'd like to know what she would do to improve this bill. I know that it will go before a committee for examination, so I'd like to hear the members' views on this. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you. I don't know whether there should be an actual amendment to the bill, but if we want to strengthen nuclear safety, perhaps we need to ask whether our interlocutors are sufficiently trained when there are nuclear safety threats. When I was in the military, I got basic training regarding intervention where there may be a nuclear threat, but this was quite basic indeed. This is a question that could be put forward. Without having an amendment per se, perhaps the dialogue or in committee would raise certain points. For instance, should our police or military or other people be further trained if there were, for instance, theft of nuclear materials? We have a big country. If we only have one specialized team, it may take some time before it can take action in the field. So should we train our police officers or firefighters or other frontline responders? That's one question, as well as medical personnel. In my hospital, I'm a nurse in intensive care and in emergency. Nurses have no training whatsoever in dealing with people who may have been exposed to nuclear materials. So perhaps rapid response by qualified medical personnel that has been trained in this and know what to do would be more appropriate. But that's something that should be raised in committee, and I'd really like us to have an opportunity to discuss that. That's why we need enough time to consider this bill in committee.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to thank my colleague for her speech and all the work that she has done. We in the NDP are determined to focus on multilateral diplomacy and international cooperation, particularly in areas where we have common concerns, including nuclear terrorism. Why I think it is important for us to work with countries that have ratified this convention. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we talk about diplomacy among different countries, one of the examples that comes to mind is, for example, the use of nuclear materials by members of the armed forces. For example, in different military sectors, when there are conflicts between different parties, will someone give up using these weapons if someone else doesn't? And for that, we have to use diplomacy. And therefore, people discuss, for example, if you stop using those materials, then I will too. And it is through diplomacy that people are able to stop resorting to those materials instead of having them in their possession. And therefore, diplomacy and cooperation among different countries allows us to reduce the amount of nuclear materials that are accessible and that could be stolen for the eventual purpose of making bombs that could go off over our heads.